Joshua 5. We're on Joshua chapter 5. Verse 1 says, Now it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard how Yahweh had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they crossed, that their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel. Can't say I blame them. Now, at times, the words Amorites and Canaanites are used in Scripture synonymously. Okay, it's a reference to the entire pagan population of Canaan. Sometimes, however, the pagan tribes live in the hill country are called Amorites, and those living near the Mediterranean are called Canaanites. But they all knew that Yahweh stopped the Jordan, that he separated the waters, that huge multitude of Israelites crossed on dry ground. They lost all hope of defeating Israel before anything started. And the wording here, their heart melted. There was no fighting spirit in them whatsoever. Remember when the spies went in there and talked to Rahab, and she said, We are very afraid. We heard how he opened up the Red Sea for you guys to cross. And she said, that's incredible. We are very afraid of you all and your Elohim. Well, they got to see it for themselves this time. The Jordan opened up for them, and that was all it took. Verses 2 and 3 of Joshua 5. At that time Yahweh said to Joshua, Make for yourselves flint knives and circumcise again the sons of Israel the second time. So Joshua made himself flint knives and circumcised the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haraloth. Now, the command is given again for the people to be circumcised. The people during that 40 years they wandered in the wilderness, they didn't do it. They neglected much of the Torah that Elohim gave them. Their males were not circumcised on the 8th day, and they hadn't been celebrating the feast days, by the way. They hadn't been doing them. So why should they get circumcised now? Yeah, they're about to celebrate Passover. See, Happy Passover. According to the Torah, anyone who is to celebrate the Passover must be circumcised. In Exodus 12, verse 48, But if a stranger sojourns with you and celebrates the Passover to Yahweh, let all his males be circumcised. Then let him come near to celebrate it, and he shall be like a native of the land. But no uncircumcised person may eat of it. And that's still true today. People who are not circumcised, men who aren't, cannot celebrate the Passover. That really is the requirement, to have a love for his Torah and to want to be a part of Israel and to be circumcised. See, that's what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians. Let a man examine himself. Okay, I remember the preacher saying that before he'd do the little the grape juice and cracker ceremony. And they call it the Lord's Supper, and everyone get a little cracker and a little thing of grape juice. Remember that? And he'd say, now, it says in Scripture, examine yourself first. In other words, if you're not in the right frame of mind, if your emotions are not just right, if you feel like there's sin in your life, do not participate. That's not what Paul meant. This was a Gentile assembly in Corinth. And none of them were circumcised when Israel came along, when Paul came along. Well, they had to get circumcised, and some lied about it. He said, no, it's because of this that some of you are sick and even asleep. Some people have died for this, is what Paul said. Oh, you make sure you guys examine yourself. I'm not going to have someone at the door checking everybody. So, still important. Still important. Verses 4 and 5. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt who were males, all the men of war, died in the wilderness along the way after they came out of Egypt. For all the people who came out were circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness along the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. Now, we're not told whether their lack of obedience was due to their unbelief or whether it was a judgment of Elohim upon them. I don't know. But regardless, their unbelief is definitely what led to their wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Verse 6. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nation, that is, the men of war who came out of Egypt, perished because they did not listen to the voice of Yahweh, to whom Yahweh had sworn that he would not let them see the land which Yahweh had sworn to their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Because of their disobedience and lack of faithfulness, the people were consumed in the wilderness. They were not even allowed to look upon that land that Yahweh had promised and would now give to their children. Only Moses got to look at it first before he died. Verses 7 through 9. And their children whom he raised up in their place, Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not circumcised them along the way. Now it came about when they had finished circumcising all the nation that they remained in their places in the camp until they were healed. Then Yahweh said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. So the name of that place is called Gilgal to this day. They circumcised the men with flint stones. I'm sure they were real sharp ones. I certainly hope they were. And then they stayed where they were for a little while. Probably didn't feel like traveling anywhere. Now, the reproach of Egypt, which he says it was rolled away, that's probably the scorn from the people of Egypt because of Israel's troubles. Gilgal means the rolling. Today I rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Verses 10 and 11. While the sons of Israel camped at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month in the desert plains of Jericho. And on the day after Passover, on that very day, they ate some of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. So that's the reason for the circumcision taking place at that time. They're now in the land. They're once again going to celebrate the Feast of Elohim. Now, keep in mind, if you're not in the land where the presence of the holiness of Elohim is, in that place that's designated, we're not really celebrating the feast days. Okay, we're practicing. We're doing the best we can with what we have. It is our attempt at obedience as much as possible. Well, the Passover really is the only feast that requires all the men to be circumcised. And they ate the produce of the land the day after the Passover. They celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread by eating unleavened bread and parched grain. Verse 12. And the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten some of the produce of the land, so that the sons of Israel no longer had manna. But they ate some of the yield of the land of Canaan during that year. The manna, it was no longer necessary. It was no longer provided. The land there produced food in abundance, so they weren't even going to need that. Verses 13 and 14. Now it came about when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, are you for us or for our adversaries? And he said, no, rather, I indeed come now as captain of the host of Yahweh. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said to him, what has my Adonai to say to his servant? Now, what's Joshua seeing here? I get, most people say, well, this is Messiah, okay? This is a pre-incarnate Jesus is what Christianity would say. Pre-incarnate Jesus. I don't think that's true. I think it's a manifestation of the Father. But he manifests himself in a lot of ways in Scripture. Okay, and manifested himself like this to Abraham too. He did it at other times. Now, Messiah, though, in particular, was his Father's Word made flesh. And he was born incarnate. He was born in a miraculous way. It was the breath of the Father and a woman that did this. And that was, see, Yeshua existed eternally as the words of the Father. And I don't believe he existed in any other form until he came a couple thousand years ago. This in particular, though, has to be a manifestation of the Father. Because if not, he'd be told not to do it. Yeah.
Was that the same instance in the Garden of Eden? With the man?
Yeah, probably so. Yeah, probably a manifestation in the Garden of Eden. If you recall, in Revelation 22, verses 8 and 9, we read, "And I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed me these things. And he said to me, 'Do not do that. I'm a fellow servant of yours and of your brethren the prophets and of those who heed the words of this book. Worship Elohim.'" So that had to be a manifestation of the Father that Joshua sees right here. And whereas John is just talking to a messenger. Verse 15, "And the captain of Yahweh's host said to Joshua, 'Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy.' And Joshua did so." Now, Joshua is told the place where he stands there is holy ground and to remove his sandals. Who else was told that? Someone else was told that. Yes, Charlton Heston was told that. And this was in Exodus 3, starting at verse 4. "When Yahweh saw that he turned aside to look, Elohim called to him from the midst of the bush and said, 'Moses, Moses.' And he said, 'Here I am.' Then he said, 'Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground.' He said, 'Also I am the Elohim of your father, the Elohim of Abraham, the Elohim of Isaac, and the Elohim of Jacob.' Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at Elohim." Now, this also to me is sufficient evidence to say that Joshua is in the presence of a manifestation of the Father. Okay? All things combined, I think, easily tell us that. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, Joshua is continuing that unfinished business that Moses was going to do. So, and he's taking the place of Moses.
So it sort of makes sense that he would have
Similar.
experience.
I agree. Yep. Let's look at chapter 6. Verse 1 says, "Now Jericho was tightly shut because of the sons of Israel. No one went out and no one came in." Now, the people of Jericho were scared. They were very frightened. I'm going to show you what the walls apparently looked like. They found the walls of Jericho, by the way. They found that's probably 100 years ago. Maybe not that long. I don't remember exactly when, but they excavated and found the walls of Jericho. We'll talk more about that here shortly. Verses 2 and 3, "And Yahweh said to Joshua, 'See, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors. And you shall march around the city, all of the men of war, circling the city once. You shall do so for 6 days.'" Okay, so Elohim says, "Hey, they're yours. I got them. They're yours. Here's what you need to do. Walk around the city." Okay? Walk around it. Now, Jericho was not a huge city, but there were hundreds of cities in Canaan. Jericho was not a huge one. I think they estimate it could have been around 9 acres, okay, on the inside the interior walls. And so the walk, we're not talking long walks here. And I find it interesting, they end up doing this for 7 straight days. Does that throw up a flag to anybody? Yeah, well, 7's completeness. But if they did it 7 straight days, they did it on at least one Sabbath. That was interesting. But, this falls under the category of do what you're told. There's a lot of conflicts with the Sabbath sometimes. If a baby's son is born, on a Saturday, and then the 8th day is Saturday, then what do? Do you circumcise him on that day? But it's the Sabbath. No, you circumcise him. You have to weigh in. You have to look at what's the weight of your issue. Okay, what's the weight of your issue? And obedience to Elohim is always the goal. Verses 4 and 5. Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. Then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And it shall be that when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up every man straight ahead. So what we have here, they're going to go around 7 times here. Then they're going to blow the trumpets. Then there's going to be a big shout. We're going to come back to that thought. Verse 6. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant. Let 7 priests carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of Yahweh. Then he said to the people, go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of Yahweh. And it was so that when Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before Yahweh went forward and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant followed them. So, they're doing they're armed men. They're not even going to be necessary, but they are armed men. And the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns blew the trumpets. The Ark of the Covenant, they're carrying that around with them too. Verses 9 and 10, and the armed men went before the priests who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark, while they continued to blow the trumpets. But Joshua commanded the people, saying, you shall not shout, nor let your voice be heard, nor let a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I tell you, shout. Then you shall shout. So when they do this march around the city, they're not going to say anything. Not going to say a word. They're going to do it in silence.
People are already nervous.
Exactly.
And they got this people not saying a thing round and round. And every day they look at the stress, it's got to be building and building.
It certainly does. Now, how many Israelites are we talking about? Fighting men? I know that 40,000 of them crossed that still had land over there, and that was only half of them. The other half stayed back and helped protect the women and work the cattle and stuff like that. We have to be talking about 500,000 fighting men, okay? Now, how many people live in that 9 acres of Jericho? It's not that many.
They didn't have repeating rifles.
No, they didn't have repeating rifles, no. No AR-15s that shoot 70 rounds a second, and nothing. That's a joke, yes, I know. Verse 11, so he had the ark of Yahweh taken around the city, circling it once. Then they came to the camp and spent the night in the camp. Now Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of Yahweh. And the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of Yahweh went on continually and blew the trumpets, and the armed men went before them, and the rear guard came after the ark of Yahweh while they continued to blow the trumpets. So that was primarily the noise that was made was just the trumpets. The people didn't say anything. No words were exchanged. No shouting. Verses 14 and 15. Thus the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did so for 6 days. Then it came about on the 7th day that they rose early at the dawning of the day and marched around the city, in the same manner 7 times. Only on that day they marched around the city 7 times. So they went 6 days marching around the city once. The 7th day, they're doing it 7 times. You have the priests with the trumpets, and you have the Levites carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Verses 16 and 17. It came about at the 7th time, when the priests blew the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, shout, for Yahweh has given you the city. And the city shall be under ban. It and all that is in it belongs to Yahweh. Only Rahab the harlot and all those who are with her in the house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. So Rahab is the only one that's going to survive, her and her family. She hid the spies when they went in there. And then now they're doing the shout. Verse 18, but as for you, only keep yourselves from the things under the ban, lest you covet them and take some of the things under the ban, so you would make the camp of Israel accursed and bring trouble on it. But all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to Yahweh. They shall go into the treasury of Yahweh. So the people shouted, and the priests blew the trumpets. And it came about when the people heard the sound of the trumpet that all the people shouted with a great shout. And the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up to the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. Okay, so the city collapsed. Now, you see what they're allowed to take. They're allowed to take the silver, the gold, the articles of bronze, and iron. Everything else they had to leave. And interestingly enough, when they uncovered these walls of Jericho, they found vials of grain that were sealed, still sealed. They were in urns that were sealed. They didn't take it, okay? They didn't take any of that stuff. They weren't allowed to. If they did, they'd be accursed. They said you can only take the silver, gold, bronze, and iron. Well, when they excavated it, the metals were gone, but a lot of that kind of stuff was still there. You know, and it's interesting, too. The judgment of Yahweh here, it's going to be it was blowing of a trumpet, then it was a shout, okay? When Messiah returns at the resurrection, it's going to be the same thing. It's blowing of a trumpet and a shout. Just like here with Jericho. If you'll recall, 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 52, in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we shall be changed. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. But when this perishable will have put on the imperishable, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then will come about the saying that it is written, death is swallowed up in victory. Now, Paul mentions the trumpet here. In 1 Thessalonians 4, starting in verse 15, we read, for this we say to you by the word of Yahweh, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of Yahweh shall not shall not precede those who have fallen asleep. For Yahweh himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet of Elohim, and the dead in Messiah shall rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet Adonai in the air. Thus we shall always be with Adonai. So, same method. You, Tom?
Yeah, that will meet in the air. That implies that heaven's somewhere other than here.
Oh, yeah, and I see your point. If you put together everything that's written about the subject of the resurrection, he's going to descend with a shout. And on his way down, going to meet him and come down. And in Zechariah, it's very clear that he's going to hit on the foot of Mount of Olives, and it's going to split, and it's going to go huge. It said, and all the saints will be with him. So we'll meet him in the air. That's why Paul wrote this like that. That's the way the logistics work out. Verse 21 of Joshua 6. And they utterly destroyed everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. So they destroyed everything. They had a lot of fighting men. They probably didn't need near as many as they had. And the people of Jericho were already disheartened. Verse 22, and Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, go into the harlot's house and bring the woman and all she has out of there, as you've sworn to her. So the young men who were spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and all she had. They also brought out all her relatives and placed them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of Yahweh. So they got all the valuables out, and they just burned everything else up. Now, from what they excavated, this is how it appeared that the walls were. They had a foundation wall here that was, 5 or 6 meters high, and then that much again or more on top of it as a wall. Okay? And then there was this earthen embankment. That's just a retaining wall down here. And then there was an upper wall here that held the inner city. And that was somewhere between 6 and 9 acres that I was telling you about. Plus, they had people living in this area here. But when they excavated that, that's what they found. That appears to be the construction. As you can see, normal, just your people down here, there's not much you could do in that day to really get through those walls. Verses 25 and 26. However, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all she had, Joshua spared. And she has lived in the midst of Israel to this day, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua made them take an oath at that time, saying, Cursed before Yahweh is the man who rises up and builds this city Jericho. With the loss of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation. With the loss of his youngest son he shall set up its gates. Well, there's a curse here. Okay? Don't ever rebuild Jericho. Don't ever do it. If you do, it's going to cost you your firstborn. He will lay it its foundation. Going to lose his youngest son. Now, you don't think in Scripture there was ever anyone foolish enough to try and rebuild the walls of Jericho, do you? That's just not possible, is it? I mean, no one would do that, right? Nobody.
Somebody that didn't hear the curse probably might have.
Well, maybe he just thought curses were for kids. Kind of like tricks. Tricks are for kids. Well, curses are for kids. There's this guy named Hiel. Remember Hiel? You don't remember Hiel, do you? In 1 Kings 16, verse 34, in his days Hiel the Bethelite built Jericho. He laid its foundations with the loss of Abiram, his firstborn, and set up its gates with the loss of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of Yahweh, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. Well, can't say he didn't warn them. Verse 27, so Yahweh was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. Now, you think he was the talk of the town? You bet, you bet. Him and all of Israel. All of Israel, all the cities in Canaan. Remember, there's 7 nations there in that land of Canaan that were mightier and greater than Israel. 7 times greater before that than times 7. And they suffered nary a loss of a man in conquering that land. And they have lost a few, which is not really recorded much. The Canaanites lost a lot, but it wasn't enough. They never finished the job. They never finished the job. They never totally wiped out those people he was commanded to wipe out.